And so we had 22.7 million and 100 investors at the beginning of 2019, and then raised 6 million more a few months later. And so now we're sitting at, just under 30 million. And that's when things start to go south.
Guys, it's Matt Haycox here, and welcome to another episode of the Matt Haycox Show. Now, if you guys like a fantastic, juicy story, and a juicy story with a business angle, and hopefully a lesson we can all learn from as well, then you are going to love today's episode, because I've got with me Chris Bentley. Now, Chris has just released a book called Burning Bellatorum, which is all about a business he founded and run, an energy resources business based out in Texas, which ultimately found its demise with a $40 million fraud. Chris has written a book all about it, and he is here right now, I guess, to tell us a story, to tell us what went wrong, what he's learned from it, what we can learn from it. And I was actually just saying to Chris off air, it's not often that I get introduced to people where I'm really kind of looking forward to listening to the story and kind of picking their brains. Typically when we get people on the show, it's normally someone that we've kind of outreached to and made a specific effort to get on. But when I saw the introduction to Chris, and I kind of read the first couple of sentences of the story, I thought this is definitely something that's going to be of interest to me. I know it's going to be of interest to my listeners. So I'm very excited to have you here today, Chris. Thanks a lot for your time, buddy.
Thanks for having me on, Matt. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here myself. Thank you.
I mean, look, I guess we've kind of told the punchline before we started, and we know that this is a story that ultimately ends up with quite a substantial fraud. But can you set the scene for us, really? I guess tell us. I know you were a Marine originally, but tell me how you got into business. You tell me how the company was formed and what those kind of formative years were like when I guess everything was rosy and before things started to fall apart.
The good old days, right? Yeah. So I got out of the Marine Corps after almost 15 years. Not to bore you with all the details, but in the United States, we had a big military drawdown under President Obama, big budget cuts, defense budget cuts. And so like a lot of other military folks back in the 2013 timeframe, I found myself getting medically discharged. And at that time, you could have a ingrown toenail, it seemed like, and get, hey, you're not medically qualified anymore. So I thought I was going to be a lifer in the Marine Corps and grow old and retire from the Marines, but it wasn't meant to be. So I'm from Texas, grew up here. Oil and gas is part of Texas culture, and somebody always knows somebody in oil and gas if grew up in Texas. So I moved back here with my family after I got out of the Marine Corps. Got a job as working in land and property acquisitions in the oil and gas industry. So, there's a job called a landman or land manager or right-of-way agent that's specific to the oil and gas industry, where you acquire properties for use by oil and gas. So I did that for 2 years, all of 2014 and all of 2015. Got laid off from the company I worked for just a few days before Christmas in 2015. So in early 2016, I started Bellatorum Resources, and it was literally just me offering services as a contractor, kind of like a one-man consulting shop, if you will. And it grew from there. Eventually got my wife to quit her job and help me. And we were buying small deals of mineral rights and oil and gas royalties and flipping them and making decent money, and I saw an opportunity to grow it, but I needed more capital than what I had to take advantage of these bigger deals out there. And so in 2017, I got my first source of external capital from an angel investor, if you will, or private investor. That gentleman was assigned to me as a coach or a mentor during my MBA program at Rice University here in Houston. And we did really well for him. And it just grew from there. We went from his original, I think, $35,000 external investment to eventually having, about 150 investors and roughly $40 million of assets under management in a very short period of time. And 2017 and 2018 were all legitimate year, good returns, everything above board. And then we go into 2019, start experiencing some normal business challenges, if you will, operational challenges, but without the runway. And this goes into how the business was structured and how the profits were shared, but basically didn't have the capital to weather the storm of those normal business challenges. And then the industry started to take a downturn, and then ultimately 2020 go into COVID, and then it was just a complete dumpster fire from there. And so,
well, let me pause you there then, because we can talk about, I guess, 2019 and 2020, but just to, I guess, so I can get my head around setting context here. So you started the business yourself in 15, 16, and you were funding it purely with your own capital at that point, were you?
yes.
And what would a typical deal look like then, in terms of what it would cost you to outlay, and what profit you would make, and then what would you do with that profit? Would that be retained by the business at that point?
Yeah, so buy a deal, let's say $10,000 to $15,000, flip it, for 20 to 25, reinvest the definitely all of the principal, some of the profits, but having to pay, my own cost of living and bills with the rest. So it wasn't, I was making a decent living, but I could never get the scale to with my own capital, because I keep in mind the reason for starting it was being out of a job where I was making, let's say, 150 to 170K a year. So mortgage payments, kids and soccer and school, whatnot. So when I brought in the external capital in 2017, that allowed me to start now reinvesting in the growth of the business, because the margin, the amount of deals I was doing was able to generate bigger tranches of capital, if you will.
And when you talk about scaling the business, I mean, what would scale have meant back then? Would that have meant doing bigger, instead of doing a 10 or 15 grand deal, it would have been doing like a 500 grand deal, or did it just mean doing lots more 10 grand deals at the same time?
It's a combination of both, actually. So in 2017, I'll give you an example. So, I bought one deal myself at the beginning of the year for 10, I think it was like 12 grand. And when I brought in the 35K from the investor, the way that came about wasn't a plan or like, hey, I need to go get external capital. It was just a conversation with this coach and mentor saying, just I'm so frustrated because I missed out on all these opportunities because I don't have enough capital. And here's one deal that I got, came in my lap today, where it's $35,000 and I could sell it next week for 50. And so the guy was like, hey, I'll provide the money, let's split the profits 50-50. And that's kind of how it was born. And then he said, hey, once you sell it, reinvest mine. And so the way that worked in the first half of 2017 is we were trying to flip really quickly. So, his 35K, we sell it for 50. Now there's 15 grand of profit. We buy the next deal for 42 roughly, but we take my share of the profits, reinvest in the business, and we hired somebody. We bought another deal, and now we start scaling. And then by 2017, a few more friends, a couple of my MBA classmates, a couple of neighborhood friends. He brought one of his colleagues in, his wealth manager, actually, and then we scaled to about 400K in capital, and we were doing a 50 grand deal, a 100 grand deal, and like all at once, right? And then turning them over and reinvesting the profits. And so we got, they all got about a 60% annualized return that year and their principal back. And so then in January of 2018, we went, now we were, I think at the end of 2017, it was, a handful, 5 or 6 people and about 400K. Then fast forward to January of 2018, we'd returned all that capital. They went and told their friends over the holidays. Now we have like 27 investors and 2.4 million in January of 2018. And we do the same thing. And then later in 2018, we get more investors, and we're up to about, I think, a total of just under 7 million in late 2018. And we did really well, flipped all the assets, returned all the capital back. So no, nothing nefarious, nothing, everything was above board. And then in 2019, still above board, when we raised the capital and everything, but our deal flow system, that's where we started having some challenges. And so we had, 22.7 million and 100 investors at the beginning of 2019, and then raised 6 million more a few months later. And so now we're sitting at, just under 30 million. And that's when things start to go south.
But just prior to that then as well, so I guess, when you've got this, the 2.4, 2.7, whatever the figure was, invested, and you're providing this kind of 60% annualized return for your investors. I mean, I don't know how the splits were working when you say kind of 50-50-ish splits. So, I mean, if you're making 60% for them on 2 point something mil and you're going 50-50, I presume, by that point you're making 5, 6, 7, 800 grand on those transactions yourself. So, and what were you doing with that at that point? Was that getting reinvested into the business, or were you starting to live larger?
No, absolutely reinvesting into the business, hiring people. I did not change my lifestyle much at all in the whole course of this thing. And in fact, I lost everything, like literally everything, my house, my retirement savings, everything I lost myself. So when I'm sure you're going to want to get into the actual fraud and how I did it and all that. But, to answer your specific question, I was having to scale my team. You remember I started from, paying myself, and I roughly making 150 grand a year, like I said, from my job in 2015, and then to running a sole proprietorship company in 2016, still paying myself about the same from all the small deals I was doing. Right. So when I really started to scale the company, I didn't scale my lifestyle, but I hired somebody, and to hire anybody decent with any type of business knowledge and oil and gas knowledge. I mean, I think my first hire was like 60 grand, salary. And then I had to hire like somebody for 120 grand. So my staff is growing. The investors are getting great returns, but I'm not making any money yet. I'm paying office rent. I'm having to move out of my house, get an actual office, because in 2016, I worked from home. 2017, we got a small, I'll call it a WeWork type facility. It's called the Work Lodge up here in Houston. But we got a small office space and hired a few people, and we're scaling that way. In 2018, I think we went, in 2017, I believe it was 5 employees. And then in 2018, I went to about 10 or 11 employees. And then at our very height, we had 21 employees. So the overhead was growing on pace with the amount of capital under management, but it was actually more than the management fee could cover, if that makes sense. So we were,
Yep.
Now that was okay in 2018 because when we made those 50-50 splits on the promote, we covered our overhead with that, right? And our growth. So in a typical fund structure, you get a 2% management fee or whatever, and that's supposed to cover your overhead. And then your promote, the money you make on the end, that's in addition, right? And
Yep.
we were structured in such a way where we got a one-time management fee up front, but 2% of $2 million is we got 2.5%, but we got a one-time fee. I think we got, I think our management fee ended up being like $59,000. Well, that was like 2 months of overhead, of rent, payroll, and whatever. Luckily, that in 2018, we flipped property so often and made a margin on the arbitrage that we paid ourselves every few months with our promote. You follow? Does that make sense?
Yep. No, I'm with you.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So that's how we funded our operation and our growth. And then, just to foreshadow a little more, we even a 2% or 2.5% management fee on $22 million. If our staff has grown, proportionally, it was still only a couple of months of overhead. And so in 2019, when we weren't able to generate those big wins quickly enough, we quickly got into deep water with our overhead, how much it was costing to keep the company afloat.
Now, tell me, we're going to talk about the actual aspects of the fraud in a moment, but let's just talk about your fundraising, because one of the questions I always get asked from my audience is how they should raise funds, how do they raise equity, etc. And my day-to-day business is raising funds, or rather providing funds. I'm a lender, secured lender, and a semi-investor back here in the UK. I always say I probably spend 80% of my life raising funds. I raise money from family offices, from high net worths, and then effectively deploy that into our lending structures. But despite the fact that it's what I spend all my days doing and something I think I've got a particular skill set in and love, I will always tell anyone that I think raising money is the hardest aspect of any business, and it's almost a business. Well, it is a business in itself. Being able to raise that capital, but I mean, not only did you raise money, you raised substantial money in a very, very short space of time. I mean, I'd be interested to know what your tactics, what your strategies were, and how that can spin into some advice. I'm guessing that that there was probably what's the word? Let's say an easy angle of greed there from investors, that if a couple of mates have made a 60% clip on the first transaction, they can't wait to fill the boots and tell all the pals about it. So maybe greed and unrealism, you were able to take advantage of from an investor base there as well. But I'm sure you did have some solid skills.
Yeah, no, I appreciate. I was thinking about that, and I've wondered how I should approach that, because I feel like I learned a lot about raising capital in that time at Bellatorum, and for several reasons, I wonder if I should even talk about it, because of have I destroyed my credibility with my story, or also the laws surrounding raising capital are so draconian, but I will say this, I would agree with you, Matt. Raising capital is extremely difficult, even when you have the introductions and the referrals from people who can vouch for your credibility. So, for example, my first investor, it wasn't just like he brought me checks from his friends that, hey, I went to my neighbor and I told him about it, and here's $150,000 from my neighbor now too, right? It doesn't happen that. You have to go have meetings. You have to explain your business model. There are so many things, especially if you are the operator. Like, you've got finance guys, right, that aren't necessarily the business operator, and so maybe some funds or companies have the ability to have a business development guy with a finance background who can talk, or should I say finance, since you're from the UK, Matt. But you get the BD guy who can go explain the ROIs and the structures and the fund structure and the promote in those terms. I was the mineral rights guy going to talk to passive investors who are used to hearing the PV7 and ROI and IRR and all this stuff, right? And besides my exposure to those terms in my MBA, I'm not a finance guy. I'm a oil and gas landman, right of way type guy who's on boots on the ground doing the business, right? So raising capital was very difficult. I had to learn how to change my vernacular in talking with people. I'm also a very blue collar guy from a enlisted military background, blue collar upbringing, and now going and sitting across the table with white collar folks who are very sophisticated investors who get pitched deals all the time, right? And so what I learned to do, because I also, at first, when people would make introductions, I'd fail miserably, because I was so like, hey, I should be at my office right now. Like, I've got work to do. And now I'm having to sit here at lunch for 2 hours. Maybe the first hour is just getting to know the person, and you've got way more experience in this than I do. And then you get into the meat and potatoes of the deal, and you got to talk while you're eating or while you're at a short business meeting, depending on the scenario. And you've got to be focused and answering this potential investor's questions, while part of my mind is like, what's going on back at the office? Is that deal getting done? And so this is like normal new business startup entrepreneurial challenges that I feel like a lot of business leaders and entrepreneurs deal with. And if I could today, 2022 Chris Bentley, go back and coach 2017 Chris Bentley, it'd be a much different story, but that's always the case, right? So hopefully my things that I put in my book and that I'm talking about here can help, potential investors and entrepreneurs and fund managers alike, because there are some nuances to raising capital that I think you don't realize until it's too late. You're in the trenches,
And did you do all the capital raising yourself then, or did there ever become a point where you had some kind of investor relations?
I did do it all myself. It's I tried to hire people to do it for me, and 99% of the time, they just didn't have. And I imagine this is a common problem, right? But they didn't have the product knowledge, if you will, or the zeal or the passion about the investment that I would. So I would get called into the meetings anyway. So if I had a guy who knew a lot of people, but he couldn't get past making the introduction to me, and then it was all on me, right? And maybe that's a common thing for entrepreneurs. But so beyond introductions, from a well-connected network, it was all on me to go put together the presentation, to explain the asset class, to explain the strategy, and to warm up the investors to where they were comfortable with me. And I also tried going to conferences, and I will tell you, the most successful capital raising avenues that I had were not from conferences, were not even from, like, I went to family office events, all different types of family office events that, some seem very reputable and the people in the audience were reputable, but my best capital raising efforts were lunch meetings and dinner meetings. And then we would set up our own, like I would rent a room out at a wine bar in the Galleria area of Houston and invite potential investors to just have a very intimate Q&A session and a free dinner and drinks. And that let's say that costs $2,000 to $3,000 to host that event. That was way more fruitful than paying the $2,000 to $3,000 of going to a family office club and setting up a booth and presenting my asset to the audience. Like, it was way, just inviting people to using your own network and hosting an event was way more. I should have done that way more, is what I guess my point.
Well, I mean, I guess it comes to, you're telling in your way, what I talk about all the time, which is the power of relationships and the power of networking, and that, ultimately, you can go to all the on paper most qualified meetings in the world, but ultimately every transaction comes down to knowing, liking, and trusting the person you're doing it with, and if you build that rapport, over wine and cheese or chit chat or whatever it may be, it doesn't matter if that person understands it less or is less credible or whatever on paper, but people, are going to buy into you. And I guess that's where you've probably accidentally found your skill set.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the easy part for most entrepreneurs should be, at least, being passionate about your particular business, right? And knowing it and so it should be easy to talk about your business with strangers. And so that was never the hard part. It was like I alluded to at the beginning, it was also just getting away from also running the business, right? And I don't know if you deal with this or you've experienced in this in the past, or have a better way of wording it for your audience, but separation anxiety, because if I'm the guy that's on the phone and in there making decisions, and you're running a very high turnover, like we got to buy this deal and literally sell it within a few weeks to make our money, every minute I spent away from the office capital raising was like giving me anxiety. Like, hey, are things going, because it's a new business, right? It's not systematized, no processes and checklist in place yet. Those are things like, you work on the business rather than in the business. Well, when you're a startup, when do you get time to do that? And then now you're pulling me away for capital raising. So I would get that separation anxiety. And one thing I had to learn was just to hey, go sit in my car, take a deep breath, say a prayer, and say, all right, look, let me just focus on this investor for this next hour or 2 hours and block out what's going on back. And then as soon as this meeting's over, I can rush back to the office. Because that was, I think, in early stages, I would be in the meetings like fidgeting, like not giving that investor my full undivided attention, because I was worried about what's going on in the office. So I had to learn how to schedule better, things better, and to really be present in those meetings.
Well, let's talk about the specifics of the fraud then. So we've kind of fast forward to 2019 time, and you've got about 40 odd million under management. When we're saying 40 million under management, at that point, are we saying there is like physically 40 million has been taken and invested in various deals? So at some point in 2019, that money has been handed over. You have invested it, and you're waiting to get a return on it.
Okay, so that's a great question. So 2019 at the beginning, it was 22.7 million. Fast forward to May of 2019, it was 28.7 million. December of 2019, I took on a $6.6 million debt. So what's that get us to? Roughly 35 million. And then I took on some more debt, private lenders, and I got roughly just over $40 million by December of 2020. All right.
Tell me, but that kind of back 18 million you just mentioned, whatever the figure was, 15, 18 million that you raised over the course of that last year, was that to go into new deals, or was that basically more money? Did you already have a problem then, and you were taking that money to plug a hole?
It's both. So let me, and I was going to get to this. So the 22.7 million, we took this is where I talked about this a little bit earlier. We took our management fee of roughly $550,000 or whatever it was. And then we ran out of that in like 3-4 months, something like that. When the first fraud I committed was in May, I believe, of 2019. And what I did is I went and raised $6 million more, and I told the investors that I had $6 million of new deals to buy, but I really only had like 5.6 or 5.5. I can't remember the exact number, but and so when I raised the $6 million, I did some finagling of moving money through different entities and forging documents to get the 400,000 operating capital. And I just told everybody it was a $6 million acquisition. All right. So that's the first fraud. But I thought, hey, look, I can sell all these assets that I bought with the 22.7 and this 6 million, minus the money I took, but I can sell it for such a profit that nobody's ever going to know. I'm going to sell it, return everybody's money, and start over. And that was the intent, right? Well, then in 2019, in the middle of the year, the oil and gas industry, specifically the mineral rights industry, started to really have some problems and challenges. There was some consolidation in the industry. There's a lot of things going on in the oil and gas industry that negatively affected our business model. And so I had no operating capital. But like almost all things in the oil and gas industry, I thought, look, this is just a cycle. I can weather the storm, you know. So I continued to bury myself by doing fraudulent things just to keep the lights on. I also alluded earlier that, I lost everything myself in the process or whatever. So like by the end of 2019, I took debt. I got a private lender to loan money, right? And I used the assets in the fund, the mineral rights that we had bought, as leverage. I was allowed to do this by law, but the unethical or thing that I did was not disclose it to the investors. So that part not criminal, but I did lie to the lender about the what I was going to do with the money. So I did buy new assets with the money, but I also used it to cover overhead, which was not allowed for the use of proceeds, right? So the lender thinks I'm going to go spend all $6 million or $6.6 million on new assets, and that they would have, so for them, it was they're thinking they're getting a super no potential loss deal because
Yep.
I'm supposed to buy all new assets, and again, keep in mind, buy all new assets in a down market, which have greater potential to appreciate than the assets that I had purchased in a higher market, right? With my investors' money. So the lender's thinking it's a slam dunk deal. Terms are great. I'm in I need capital, typical kind of like, call it hard money lending type deal, high interest rate, lots of collateral for the leverage. So anyway, I start using some of their money for buying new assets, but some of their money for covering the overhead too. That's December of 2019 and January of 2020. And then COVID comes, right? And so, holy shit, now the world is fucked, excuse my language, but now I'm in 2020 having already committed some fraud and lying and trying to just survive. And so then I'm still thinking like, hey, this pandemic thing, this can't last forever. I'm not going to call it quits. So then I go start doing like getting other private lenders to loan money. And then I started giving my own assets as collateral. My house, my cars, they were paid off. My house and cars were paid off. But like, I did this to multiple people, doing personal guarantees and levering these assets, and to multiple groups. And then it got to a point in April of 2021 when I went and turned myself in, where I just couldn't do it anymore. And there were some very probable opportunities to raise a significant amount of capital, and what I had planned to do with that. Some people call it a Ponzi scheme. Maybe it is by legal definition or whatever, but keep in mind, there were real assets that were cash flowing. It'd be like owning a bunch of real estate that pays royalties every month. So that's what, or pays rent every month or royalties, whatever you want to call it. But we had cash flowing assets. So what I was going to do is my goal was to get $100 million, make all the debt and the old investors go away, move all the assets into a new partnership with one big institutional investor, like a pension fund or something like that, right? And then it was going to be a patient capital structure with like at least a 7 to 10 year deal, big amount of money, where then I could also purchase new assets, add to the older assets, and reinvest the rental income, because most of the pension funds don't want distributions. They just want growth. So I figured, all right, look, I'd have 7 to 10 years to use these assets to build a bit. And then a management fee on $100 million fund, more than enough to cover our overhead, we'd be all right. So that was the ultimate plan. But it got to a point where every conversation I was having was such a lie. Like I would have to look at people knowing that this was my plan. And it got to the point where I was like extremely suicidal. I couldn't even, at night when I would get home from the office, I'd get home really late, and I would literally just go sit in the backyard with a glass of bourbon and like just stare into space and like contemplate like killing myself literally. And it's, so.
But tell me, so but when you turned yourself in, the 40 million had all gone, or was there anything left?
It was gone in the sense of the cash was gone. There were assets, but then keep in mind, I levered I used all the investors' assets as collateral, meaning that I used the investors' cash to buy properties that had cash flow, right? Then so now the lender foreclosed, if you will, lack of better terms. They took all those assets. So not all 40 million is gone.
Because I was going to say, I mean, I'm obviously only doing rudimentary maths while we're talking, but obviously you're talking about the bulk of the kind of fraudulent money being used to pay the ongoing running costs. But I mean, if they were, I don't know, well, if they were 200-300 grand a month or something, even 300-400 grand a month, okay, that explains 4-5 million of it disappearing. But if the rest of it was in assets, whether it's oil and gas deals or property assets or whatever, there should still be I don't know, 20 of that 40 left or something, right?
Yeah. So there's a lot of detail to go into that, right? But let's say I purchased $22 million worth of properties at the beginning of 2019. Well, now you could argue over what the value of those were. Was it 22 million? Was it 20 million? Was it 25 million? Did I make good investments or not? That's one conversation, right? But then they're definitely worth way less in 2020 or 2021 when everything went,
Sure.
So there's that loss. There's just value loss in the investments, but there's the total loss to the investors, not the lender. The lender refers to themselves as an investor as well. But anyway, so my investors lost almost all their money minus the royalty distributions I was making to them every few months, right? Because we had cash flow coming in. So we made some distributions that were legitimate distributions based on cash flow, right? And then we also lost all those properties, though, to the lender. So now the investors have their loss. The lender argues that their losses are based on inaccurate valuations and because the terms of our contract with the high interest rates I didn't meet. So the lender is going to be saying, hey, they lost that $6.6 million they loaned me was supposed to be worth 12 million or whatever, because they were supposed to get that money back in a short period of time with interest and all that. And so those losses are in there. But it sounds like you just want to know, not every dollar of that 40 million was lost. And those assets are still out there owned by the lender, cash flowing every month. So you need a forensic accountant to really figure out the exact dollar amount of loss, but I don't know that number.
Okay, but so let's go from there. Then let's talk about you went to turn yourself in. Who did you do that to? To the FBI? It said on my notes.
Yeah, so I did not know how to go about doing it, right? So you think like if you call the police, I'm assuming in the UK, if somebody tries to break into your house or whatever, right? Or there's a Crime Stoppers number or whatever you call, but like, who do you call when you want to turn yourself in for a crime and of this nature, right? So
had you not sort of spoke to a lawyer at this point? Then had you not gone to take legal advice for them to walk in with you?
Well, I did hire a lawyer eventually, and so I'm getting to that because I hired one lawyer, and the guy was like, I wouldn't turn yourself in, dude. Like, and I was like, no, man, I need to. And he was like, just try to keep raising the money. If you think you can make it all right. Cause you remember I told you I had a really viable potential institutional investor that was getting really close. And he was like, if you think that deal's going to go through, just do it. Nobody will ever know,
what a lawyer.
Yeah. So I called one of my friends, I guess he's a friend. He seemed like it at the time. But anyway, I lied to him and said, hey, man, one of my neighbors is thinks he's a victim of fraud. Who should he call? Should he call is it Harris County or Sheriff's Department? Like, how do you and so my friend, I knew that this friend of mine was a lawyer, is a lawyer, and I knew he would know which exact agency or phone number to call. So through kind of lying about what the scenario was, he asked me questions like, well, what's the dollar amount? What's the scenario? Is it a business? Is it investment? What type of fraud is it? And so this friend of mine connected me with the lawyer that I hired, because all my friend's thinking on the phone, he's like, oh, give your neighbor this phone number and David will help him out. So I went and hired David, and David said, this is a crime where you need to turn yourself into the FBI and the Department of Justice. This isn't like a local, this is something that the local agencies won't want to handle or know how to handle or be able to handle, whatever. So he sets up a meeting with the FBI's, white collar crimes division, or what, some contact he knows from previous cases he's worked, and a specific United States attorney or your assistant United States attorney in the Department of Justice. And we have a meeting at David's office. And I told David, I'm like, look, I'm not looking for you to help bail me out or defend me. I just want to turn myself in. So I don't have like an attorney in the sense of, I'm not paying for hourly guidance and rate. I just said, hey, help me turn myself in, and we'll go from there, because I didn't have money. As I mentioned to you, I lost everything. I didn't have money to hire an expensive lawyer, and I didn't want one. I just wanted to say, you know what? Let me go pay my debt to society, turn myself in. If I have to go to jail, I'll go to jail. And I thought that day that I would be going away in handcuffs, and they just said, hey, we'll be back in touch with you. So it was a very odd experience.
So you turned yourself in, and then presumably they just asked you to kind of tell the story.
Yes, they just said, hey, go ahead.
And what I was going to say, so what happened from then? Because I'm kind of cutting to the end of the story, but obviously I've read that you haven't been charged with any crime. I mean, is it still ongoing? I mean, because again, my let's say obviously layman's view of US financial crime, etc. is they don't seem to mess around over there, and they're a lot tougher than we seem to be in the UK. And when I see any kind of what could be considered relatively minor financial crimes in the US, you normally see someone in cuffs within minutes, and it's penalised a lot more heavily than it would be in the UK. I mean, obviously, what, more than a year's passed since now, and still nothing's been done.
Yeah, I mean, it's very weird to me. Maybe it's normal. I don't know what normal is over here, because I thought the same thing as you. And I mean, I just posted on LinkedIn about this the other day, but it's, the investors deserve justice, right? They want to see some closure, I imagine. And I selfishly, for me and my family, I want to get, like, just whatever it is. I'm not asking for a deal. Let's just get this, so I can now view a path forward for restitution, for redemption, all those things. But I'm just kind of sitting in the, I think I referred to it earlier as purgatory. It's like, I don't know what to do. My family doesn't know what to do. The investors don't know what to do. I mean, I've written this book as 100% attempt at restitution. I mean, all the money will go to them. But I can't make other moves until I've gotten this behind me. And it's very frustrating. I see stories on the news about people getting arrested almost weekly in the US for financial crimes related to healthcare fraud and PPP fraud and stuff that I know those cases didn't even start until after I turned myself in. So the time and these are people that did not turn themselves in. So you got to think like, all right, this dude is getting investigated, arrested, and charged and sentenced in a shorter time frame than me going and handing over all the evidence and turning myself in, and I'm still sitting here with no idea, not even a charge, not even a communication saying, hey, we're going to get to you in 2 months. Okay. So like I would argue that I would assume that my case is very unique in that regard because, but I don't know why. I don't know what the answer to that, to why they're taking so long. I have no idea because I mean, I without a doubt broke the law. I committed forgery. I lied about use of proceeds. I mean, bank fraud, wire fraud, forgery, whatever, mail fraud, whatever the different, legal definitions are. I definitely did those things. And, maybe it's because my intent, I don't know how much intent plays into their decision making on what they pursue and don't pursue. But I think at the minimum, the investors deserve some sort of closure and sense of justice. Because I mean, most people I talk to, they say, "Hey, we don't think you were a nefarious bad guy, out living a lavish lifestyle." But still, the investors, the majority of
Sure.
them, they want to see me get punished, and rightfully so. So
And what have you been up to since then, other than other than reading the book, writing the book even? Have you done anything else? Have you started any other business, or are you still obviously waiting to try and find closure to this before doing anything?
I've just been working, odd jobs here and there. And I worked at a thrift store, like kind of like Goodwill, but a smaller local thrift store for about 6 months. But then, I got a call a couple of months back saying, hey, the feds are ready to move forward. So when I got that call, I went and I hired a replacement, got the thrift store set up so they wouldn't be left high and dry. Well, so I quit the thrift store job. It was a mutual thing it wasn't like, I got it set up so that they would have a manager in place. And but then 2 months later, I still haven't heard anything. And so now I'm like, man, did I do that prematurely? So now I'm looking for another job, just something to pay the bill and keep the family fed.
Look, let's talk about lessons learned then, and I guess there's two sides to this. I mean, obviously, there's what you've learned as an individual and a kind of an operator of a business yourself. But I guess before we get on to you, what do you think the takeaways for investors are here? I guess other than not being naive and blinded by greed, and therefore probably allowing themselves to make decisions that they shouldn't have made if they'd have done further due diligence. I mean, what do you think people could have done differently to have not ended up in this predicament?
Well, two things that you're asking from the investor's perspective for this
Hmm.
question, right? So, two things for investors, and this, you know, coming from me, I'm going to sound like such an asshole telling investors this, right? But it's it's the truth. It's what I feel because it's the feedback I've received from investors and what I've heard. So many people invested money they could not afford to lose, right? Like that they're talking about catastrophic life-changing losses here. And I don't know how much of that is dramatized or sensationalized, but let's just take it at face value. If that's the case, I would say no investor should ever invest money they can't afford to lose. So if it's, you shouldn't plan your future spending off of an investment, right? I don't, that's my personal view. So like if people had invested all their retirement, I was not aware of what, just I want to make that clear, like where their money came from, what their plans for it were, or whatever. They just sent their money. I was not an investment advisor, but I learned later on after, I came clean with all this, that a lot of people had taken debt and invested it, gotten loans to invest in our fund, had like gotten their kids' college money out to invest it and things. And these are supposedly accredited, sophisticated investors, like some very wealthy people, right? And I've learned that even though those wealthy people, they had, sophisticated white collar jobs types, finance types, oil and gas types, had taken money and put it in this investment. And I would just say, from an investor's lesson, never invest money you can't afford to lose. All right. Investment, lesson number one. But secondly, the documents, when you invest in an alternative, it's not like buying publicly traded asset, stocks and bonds and things that are liquid. It, and the it's a new it's an a different type of an investment when you invest in alternative investment funds like ours. And so the documents, knowing the documents and the structure is very important. That's actually a lesson for investors and the entrepreneur, because I structured my investment in a way where I could not weather any type of storm. My management fee was not enough to cover my overhead. And I was just so confident in my past performance that I never thought forward enough to say, "Hey, I need some cushion built into my operating documents that allow me to get capital in a legal, transparent manner to keep the business afloat." So I would argue that investors need to look for, when they're investing in alternatives, they need to read the very boring 75 to 100-page documents. As much as you don't want to read them, you need to read those with a fine-tooth comb and look for any, because my documents, any halfway savvy business person would have looked at my documents and said, well, what the hell does this guy do if he can't, if he spends all the management fee and hasn't had a chance to generate any windfall profits in the, like, you know what I'm saying? It would have been clear that I couldn't have afforded to run that company unless I generated profits. And businesses are allowed to not be profitable. So you need to make sure that those operating documents and those agreements have mechanisms in place that handle that, whether it's forcing the manager to lay people off or to lower the overhead, or to do capital calls for overhead or whatever. I didn't have any of those mechanisms, and the investors didn't have any insight as to how was I going to weather a storm, right? And a storm came.
And what do you think the biggest takeaway for you is? For yourself as a business owner, what's your biggest lesson?
So for myself, and for other business owners and entrepreneurs, is that failure is an option. And I've said this before, but I was so brought up, call it from my childhood, from the Marine Corps, that, hey, failure's not an option. You never quit. You keep hammering, you're going to get it, and so I was in this, like, I cannot fail. Whatever I got to do, whatever it takes to not fail, was my mentality. And that was wrong. Like, failure is okay as long it's how you handle the failure, right? Like, I could have said in 2019, I took that management fee in January of 2019, and my thinking was, like, if I give the investors their money back, I've already spent 2% of it. Like, I'm already failing because it would be a loss, right? So if the right thing to do, though, would have been in February or April, March, in that first Q1 of 2019, would have been to say, hey, investors, I'm sorry, but here's your money back that I haven't spent yet. I'll sell the assets we had and we'll just close up shop, or at least take a pause and go back to the drawing board and try to figure out what the problems are. And then we'll come back to you later. That would have been a mini failure, right? And maybe I probably would have lost half my investors they would have been like, nah, I'm not messing with you. You're an amateur or whatever. But probably half would have been understanding and forgiving, and maybe even respect the fact that I had minimized the losses and gotten ahead of it, right? But in my mind, I was thinking that would have been an utter and complete failure, and that I have to avoid that at all costs. So, I know I'm getting long-winded there, but I would just want to reiterate and beat the point that you can fail, and if you do it with integrity and grace, and the way that you stand up and you just face it and be transparent with everybody, that you can live to fight another day. But now I've failed in such a extreme fashion that who knows if I'll ever be able to be in an executive leadership role, much less, I know I'll never be able to manage other people's money again, but even I may never be able to be an officer in a company where I manage assets. I may not even be able to be an employee of a company.
I mean, let's ignore what happens from a kind of a penalty or sanctions perspective for a minute, and let's assume that you do. I don't know. you've managed to swim the channel and get away with this as relatively painlessly as possible. What would you like your future career to be? Do you think this has scarred you personally irreparably, or do you think you've got another business in you? Assuming you were allowed to, are you kind of ready to build and run a business again?
Absolutely. I think I'd be even more qualified to now than I was, before this whole experience. So I'm not personally scarred in the sense of where I won't be willing to do it again. I think just from what my current life circumstances are prohibit me from doing that. So I am kind of in this limbo or purgatory stage. But if, let's say I get several years in prison, I would absolutely 100% come out of that and try to be an entrepreneur again. And I think I have a lot to offer. I think I have some leadership skills that, I would wager that people who've worked for me in the past, a lot of them enjoyed it and would say that I have some skills there that can transfer over to new businesses or new organizations. So I'm not at all giving up on life and business. But as I mentioned earlier, I need the authorities to do their thing before I can make a path, to plan out a path forward.
Cool. Well, listen, Chris, it's been absolutely, fascinating and eye-opening talking to you. And I know that if I can say that as someone who's been, I guess, surrounded by these kind of stories and problems for the last 20 plus years, I'm sure, for my more, virginal audience, that they'll have been enthralled by the story you've had to tell. I mean, guys, if you want to really dig deep into this and read the full book, as I said at the beginning of this podcast, Chris has recently released his book, which is called Burning at Bellatorum, and it's I guess subtitled "The Story of a $40 Million Fraud and Its Priceless Lessons by Investors and Entrepreneurs." I'll certainly be getting a copy. I can take it away for my summer reading, and I know that a lot of you guys are going to enjoy reading it too. Chris, I mean, before you go, anything else you want to plug or tell us? Where else can we find you? Where else can we get some information?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the most active on LinkedIn. If you looked up, search Chris Bentley on LinkedIn, there's not too many of them, so I'm sure I should pop up there. And the book is only available on Amazon. It's self-published, and I would appreciate the support, and I know my investors would, because all the proceeds go to paying back the investors. So, Matt, I really appreciate you having me on. And I guess that last point, just the lesson is that failure is an option. It's how you fail, not if you fail, right? So.
Perfect. Well, listen, great takeaway, Chris. Thank you very much. Guys, you can find Chris on LinkedIn, like he says, and you can get his book on Amazon. So please make sure you do. And as always, I'm Matt Haycox. I am the Matt Haycox, TheMattHaycox, on everything social. If you've been watching this on the video version, you can listen to the audio version on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you want to consume your podcast. And if you listen to the audio, you can come over to YouTube and see my pretty face too. And until the next episode, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you've enjoyed Chris's story. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.